reality is that we face several key problems. The main one of these is the lack of infrastructure required across Europe, such as charging stations, for example. Another problem would be to have a grid able to meet the new demand of electricity for electric vehicles. We must therefore look carefully at how best to increase the use of zero emissions vehicles without destroying existing jobs. Today, I hope that we can discuss some of these ways in which we can make up for the shortcomings of this new technology. Equally, we must ask questions how about it will change our way of life, including how industries such as trucking and logistics must adapt to meet the demands of the Green Deal. And of course, how we bridge the infrastructure gap that exists today between East and West and North and South. Finally, I would like to thank you very much for all speakers and our sponsor, Hyundai, for their hard work in putting this event together. And to all of you, colleagues, for your contribution to this important debate. I hope that this debate will be the beginning of exchanging of views on the European Parliament, European Commission level, serious exchanging of views, taking account different arguments which would allow us to find the final solution, win-win solution, both for reducing emission, but also for keeping and having our industry safe and very well developed. So this is my great thanks for all of you. Stay in touch, and I wish you great debate and all the best for all of you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Thomas. So let's start immediately with the questions. And if you allow me, I would first like to get started with a question to the representatives of the private sector to try and understand how the market is developing. So let's start with you, Ralph van Nuffel from Hyundai. So getting the right infrastructure for electric or hydrogen cars or trucks implies some assumptions about future demand. So where do we stand there? My understanding is that the car market is now overwhelmingly turning to electric vehicles, while demand for hydrogen vehicles is now expected to come mostly from heavy good vehicles or the public transport sector. Is that your understanding as well, Ralph van Nuffel?
Yeah, correct. So the speed of electrification to begin with is very different between passenger cars on the one hand and all the commercial vehicles on the other hand. So let's first start with the passenger cars. I think the trend today is very clear towards battery electric vehicles, also plug-in vehicles as well as the full battery electric. And we believe also for the time being, this is really the trend that will continue. Even though plug-in hybrid is really a technology that we also see as more a transition technology, it's very difficult to say how long this transition period will last. But we believe after plug-in hybrid, maybe hydrogen could also be a viable solution for passenger cars. So today, the offer is very limited. We do have the Nexo as a passenger car as a fuel cell EV. Some other OEMs have different products, but the offer is very limited. So therefore, the demand is also limited, and the infrastructure is actually almost non-existing. Just in a few markets like Germany and France, there is a very basic infrastructure, but this requires a lot of effort to deploy this if we want to continue also on passenger car hydrogen vehicles. Then on the commercial vehicle side, electrification is a bit slower in general. There again, we see the first trends are also, we have our joint venture in Switzerland, for instance. So by 2025, we're talking about 1,600 units of heavy duty trucks running on hydrogen. So this is a relative number, of course. We want to expand also to other areas in Europe, But again, the prerequisite to do so is the infrastructure, as I said. So there we have to see how the balance goes between battery electric or other types of electrification on the one hand and hydrogen. But we see the viability, especially on the heavier duty trucks, quite positive.
Okay, and so taking it from there, rather Nuffel, so what do you think should be the EU's strategy when it comes to infrastructure deployment? Obviously, the European level is broader and covers the entire EU market, but there may be also some initiatives at the national level. So how should all of that be coordinated, and what should be the EU's role in that?
Yeah. So the big driver behind the electrification are the CO2 targets that we as OEM need to comply with. So 2020 was a big milestone for us, and the next one will be 25, and then beyond that 2030 are really become more stringent, and then we see that really as a driver for electrification. So these targets are for us binding. So if we miss them, we pay penalties even. And we would, the prerequisite to increase the mix of EVs is really the infrastructure. So the product, of course, needs to be competitive. Pricing is also an important element in that. But without an infrastructure in place, no customer will even consider buying a full electric vehicle. So what today is lacking is, let's say, the same binding element in the way the infrastructure will be deployed in the coming 10 years, let's say.
Okay, calls then for some more binding targets, I suppose, when it comes to both electricity charging points, but also for hydrogen, I guess, huh?
We're talking infrastructure is both, actually. Yeah. We should have, let's say, a balanced approach. Electrification is purely is mainly now on battery electric, but the volumes are relatively limited, so there is no pressure on the grid yet, let's say. So on the long term, definitely hydrogen fueling infrastructure is also a priority. And what the CO2 targets for us mean we have to we show strong commitments and investments in the end to be ready for the future, to be ready with a product lineup which on the one hand addresses the needs for the customer, and then on the other hand is also meeting all the requirements in terms of regulation and CO2 targets. So I think it's just common sense that the same level of commitment is shown on the infrastructure side.
Okay, so let's turn now to the speaker from PKN Orlen, who are actually on the retail side of things. So Gregor Josiak, what are your own assumptions as PKN Orlen when it comes to electric versus hydrogen-powered vehicles?
Okay, thank you for the question, and thank you for invitation for this event. Regarding our strategy, we would like to develop both solutions, yes, but like it was mentioned, let's say battery vehicles and this charging infrastructure, we see that this solution is dedicated mainly for passenger cars because of the this is connected with time of charging, with some challenges with this electricity supplying. And regarding the hydrogen solution, hydrogen vehicles, we see that they place in heavy duty trucks and city transports. And regarding, if I can say a few words about our strategy regarding this hydrogen infrastructure, because this is quite big challenge for us, but we declared last year this carbon neutrality direction. So a few days ago, we announced one of our biggest infrastructure project connected with hydrogen to mobility, and this project is covering the Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, and is dedicated for building full infrastructure, production infrastructure of hydrogen, and also hydrogen refueling station network. And from this perspective, our main goals in this Hydrogen Eagle project is to build more than 100 hydrogen refueling stations till 2030, with also, as I mentioned, full infrastructure of production of hydrogens from different sources, mainly from renewable energy sources, wind and PV farms, but also from municipal waste processing. And this is, in my opinion, regarding the infrastructure comparison between charging, electrical charging, and hydrogen, let's say, infrastructure. This is big different if we are talking about cost of investment, yes, because this hydrogen refueling station is need to full infrastructure of storage solution for refueling, but also distribution and also production side, and everything need to be realized in specific standards. Yes, so our main goal is, of course, reduction of CO2 in transport, in fuels. Today we are producer mainly of standard fuels, diesel, gasoline. So our direction is to implement also hydrogen for the market, for transportation. And our main goal of the Hydrogen Eagle project is to reduce 1 million ton CO2 per year. So this is big challenge, but take account this all assumption for this project, it can be realized. Thank you.
Okay, Gregor, Josiak, maybe you can say a few words now about the kinds of incentives that you think should be put in place, whether at the EU level or maybe at the national level as well, whether it's for hydrogen infrastructure or for electric recharging stations. Do you support, for example, the idea of mandatory targets for infrastructure in the same way that there are mandatory targets on car manufacturers to reduce CO2?
For sure, this is big challenge regarding building this kind of infrastructure, and take into account that we represent business. We see that, as an example of this Hydrogen Eagle, we see the funding, that there is existing funding gap, and it needs some kind of subsidy support regarding implementation of this program. And even if we are talking about this project, we submitted it to the important project of common European interest, IPCEI mechanism. And this is good idea from this kind of perspective to build this kind of IPCEI programs dedicated for hydrogen, because we can build international infrastructure, not only locally. Like today in Germany, there are many hydrogen refueling stations. In Poland, there are no existing infrastructure. So from this point of view, this is good idea to have mandatory obligation, but it should be taken into account the existing situation of each country, each infrastructure situation in each country. So today we see that CO2 cost of emission of CO2 when we produce the standard fuel is very, very high, and we need to pay for that. So for us, this is from one hand, this is cost side, but we expect that this kind of programs like IPCEI mechanism or other programs which support this kind of building, this kind of infrastructure will appear, because without that it will be really difficult to this kind of big projects.
Okay, thank you, Gregor. Let me turn now to Charlotte Mathiessen from the Cabinet of Transport Commissioner Dina Vălean. So a similar question to you, Charlotte. What are the Commission's assumptions when it comes to the deployment of infrastructure for zero-emission vehicles? Is it mainly about electrification, or do you see a role there as well for hydrogen? And then we'll have a discussion about incentives after that.
Thank you. So I think you might be expecting this reply from me, but of course the Commission will try as much as possible to remain technological neutral in its policy making. So we're not, let's say, favoring one over the other, but in our whole exercise of the European Green Deal, and more specifically the Fit for 55 package, there's been, of course, impact assessments and for each proposal, and these impact assessments are based on a common, what can I call it, a common scenario for 2030 and 2050. And this common scenario is based on the climate target plan, and has used then and looked into different modelings, economic modelings for the years ahead. And of course, these economic modelings are, let's say, a little bit guessing then, or that's not the word, but looking into what will be the tendencies for electric vehicles, hydrogen vehicles, and the share of the markets. And so I think using this economic model, what you also presented in your introduction is also the tendency that we're seeing now. And I think here it's also, I think we can also say clearly that as much as, not as much, but you have electricity that will play a big role. You also have hydrogen that will play a big role, but not to forget that LNG, especially for heavy duty vehicles, will also play a role, not as big a role, but a little role for heavy duty vehicles, because we're not getting there tomorrow. So we need to take into account the first 10-15 years here. So based on this scenario, of course, we have then been working on towards a dynamic way of, well, if I can already go into the incentive side, then we're working towards having a more dynamic way of having the incentives. So I think I can say clearly, and I think the Commissioner Vălean has also said this already in her speeches, that we will be proposing binding targets for the alternative fuel infrastructure proposal. So in this sense, now the devil is in the details, of course, and these binding targets, they're necessary to be dynamic, and really, as also suggested by Grzegorz, take into account the situation of each member state. We're also very much aware that the market is evolving fast, and eventually it is up to the market to decide and lead the way of which technology, let's say, takes a more prominent role in each transport mode and transport segment. So we're also considering to have a quick revision clause, so that we, for the proposal, now I'm already talking about a revision clause and the proposal hasn't even come out, but I think this is important to state from the beginning that we need to move fast, propose this fast, adopt it fast, and then revise also as soon as we see the market evolve also.
Yes, because the market is evolving extremely fast, and this is one of the challenges indeed that policymakers have. I mean, we saw it in the previous clean energy package in the previous commission, that the assumption on renewables, for example, was changing as the negotiations were taking place on the updated renewable energy directive. And so it's often true that the policies sometimes lag behind because the markets move really fast. Now, you spoke about mandatory targets in the alternative fuel infrastructure directive. So there will be, just to make that clear and without revealing too much, I suppose, but so there would be mandatory targets for electric charging points. There's always this discussion between public and private. So will there be a distinction for that? And then you said it as well, there's not just electric charging points, but there's also hydrogen, potentially LNG. So will all these different types of fuels or energy sources or carriers, will all of them be concerned by the mandatory target exercise?
I think I will leave that for the surprise effects, but definitely we have been looking into all transport modes. I think this is important to say that the proposal is evolving into a wider proposal, not only for road and maritime, but really looking at all for modes. And also we're also going much more into details in terms of segments. So when we're talking about road, we're looking at light duty vehicles compared to heavy duty vehicles and what the different needs are between the two segments. So I think that's what I can say for now.
Thank you, Charlotte, for revealing as much as you could. Alexandra Vondra, what are your thoughts about all this? So the Parliament will be expected to take a position at some point when these proposals come and are put on the table. What will be your approach as an MEP?
Okay, thank you very much. So I think, first of all, just to reduce this on the discussion about the mandatory targets on building of the infrastructure, I think it's poor, and we should start from a very different corner here, despite the fact that the lack of the infrastructure, either, lack of the charging station, lack of the grids able to accommodate this future high demand of the electricity, are serious challenges that would have to be fixed. But I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge that, the solution for personal transportation is just a part of the larger picture of the Fit for 55. And here, I think in particular, the personal transportation, because, you have acknowledged that the trucks and the commercial transportation is really lacking behind, with the electricity solution. Then it's mostly about the personal cars, and I am a politician, and I have to take into account the consequences of this. And here, number one, the transportation as a proportion, or the personal transportation as a proportion of the CO2 emissions in general in Europe is objectively lacking behind, the emission of CO2 produced by energy sector and industry as such. So, for example, it does not mean, to push very fastly for the solution in transportation towards the electric vehicles, and at the same time to have still the production of electricity mostly by the fossil fuel. That doesn't make any sense, And this phasing out of the coal, the gas, of course, it will take some time, So we do have the horizon of the 10 years for phasing out to meet the target of minus 55 in general in the EU. So maybe it makes sense to go faster in the countries like Austria, which produced everything by hydro, it makes the sense to do this in Denmark or Ireland because they can have the windmills everywhere. But, you know, Poland, Czech Republic, Germany too, it's much bigger challenge. So it's number one. And for me, the conclusion is that without the detailed impact assessment, not just for the EU as a whole, but for every single EU member state, you know, that must be alpha and omega of any kind of a decision making. Detailed impact assessments done in a general map, you know, because just to have more electric cars and the production of electricity of the coals, it doesn't make any sense. Then is a second challenge is to the automotive industry. There is the group of states which proposed the end of the combustion engines very soon. They have one thing in common. They don't have any automotive industry at all. While, for example, my country, the Czech Republic, automotive industry, it's 10% of the GDP. Yeah? So, yes, you know, big business loves the monopoly environment, regulation if there is a guaranteed, if the profit is guaranteed. But then is also the demand side problem. And it's not just about infrastructure, it's also about the money in the people's wallet. And look, the French, they wanted to intensify a little bit and then had the yellow vest in the streets very soon, just for the minor increase of the carbon tax on the fuel. And I think that we have to take this into account too, because, you know, to follow the model of, for example, Germany and France, when, you know, the state is offering 8,000 euro, you know, as an incentive to buy an electric car, that's the prescription to fiscal catastrophe in the post-COVID economies, with a devastating impact on the Eurozone as such. So, you know, I think we have to solve this problem in the whole complexity, together with the changing of the energy mix, etc., and not just solemnly that we see that there is a lack of infrastructure. I think that this is not the only case why the demand for the electric cars is so low. And maybe one last comment. I think, you know, I love the competitive environment, and that's also important for the future of the European automotive industry. And the electric solution, just, you know, it's not the only road ahead. You know, you mentioned hydrogen. Nobody has mentioned the synthetic fuels without any CO2. So let's build an environment for the business that would continue to be competitive and would bring the innovation. You know, just the orientation on electric cars. You know, China, Japan, and others, they are more far with that because it's a software, it's a battery development, and the Asia is far advanced here, and we are losing the only competitive advantage. It is a German ability to, you know, very good mechanics, which makes them competitive in combustion cars, and we are just giving up this.
So, Alexandra Vondra, maybe just to make things clear, what do you think should be the role of the European Union in all this? I mean, you said there should be, that the EU should pay attention to the different starting points of the different countries. So would you say, would you be at all in favor of those mandatory targets that Charlotte Mathiessen was speaking, if they were adjusted according to the different countries, or are you against the mandatory targets, what, you know, in every circumstance?
I think that first of all, we need to prepare the detailed impact assessments, firstly. Secondly, to prepare the legal path which would take into account the technological neutrality and thus would keep the competitive environment. Then also it must be interconnected with the development of energy mixes in the individual member states. And then if all those questions are answered, then we can, as a result of a larger map, even to follow the road with some mandatory targets tailored according to the impact assessment, according to technological neutrality principle. So tailor and the development of the energy mixes in the individual member states, then we can have a mandatory targets, but tailored for individual member states.
Okay, so that is clear enough. Let's turn to funding now, because you alluded to that, Alexandra Vondra. I mean, this doesn't come necessarily cheap, and there can be an impact also on the fuel prices. We saw how that ended in France with the Gilets jaunes. So who do you think should, at the end of the day, pay for the deployment of infrastructure? Let's start with Charlotte Mathieson, maybe, if you could say a few words about, who foots the bill in the end.
Yes, thank you. So I think we have to see this a little bit also in phases, in the sense that right now we need a high boost of infrastructure rollout, and in this initial phase of a couple of years, we will need support from public institutions to support the rollout. So here we would need both. Of course, you have the recovery and resilience funds and plans, which will be providing already, and we see it with the plans that are now being adopted this weeks, that the recharging infrastructure play a big role in many member states. Then the regional and cohesion funds will continue also to play a role here. You have also InvestEU, who will play a big role also to support the rollout of infrastructure. And then I think for the cherry on the cake, maybe even of course, you have the Connecting Europe facility, which has already now a dedicated blending facility for alternative fuel infrastructure, which already exists. And the plan and what we're looking into right now, together with member states, is to really increase radically the wallet of this blending facility to really be able to support the targets that are coming with the proposal as well. So I think this is a little bit from the EU side of things, but I think also from member states there will also be support and interest in helping on the rollout. But so this is the first phase, and then in the second phase, of course, we shouldn't forget, and I think Raf will also and Grzegorz will both agree with me here that very soon recharging and refueling stations will become a real business case, and so we have to find this right balance so that we don't crowd out private investments. And we see this already in Switzerland, I think, where and also in the Netherlands, where recharging points have become economically viable and an interesting place to invest. So it's this balance where we have to support the uptake, and then for the private sector to take over when the market is ready.
Yeah, you mentioned all the funding opportunities which are available right now with the recovery plan, etc. These are funds coming from the European budget. But do you foresee as well regulatory incentives to try and encourage those investments to take place?
I have to say I don't have a clear answer for this one, but no.
That's okay.
You left me blank there, but
I guess this will also come into play at some point, because you can't rely just on public funding. I mean, obviously there will be a business case, like you said, but there could be also adjustments to bits and pieces of regulation to try and encourage those investments.
Yeah. I think I'm curious, of course, also to hear from the private sector here, but what they're interested in and looking for. But I think maybe one angle, and which is coming up more towards the autumn, is that we have also the revision of the 10T regulation and the urban mobility package coming. And within this framework, we have the sustainable urban mobility plans. And the sustainable urban mobility plans are ways for cities to become more sustainable and even reach towards climate neutrality if they're very ambitious. So in this regard, there could be a way to maybe help even more in terms of funding the cities which have put in place such sustainable urban mobility plans.
Okay, thanks for that. So let me turn now to the private sector with Gregor Josiak. What are your views about who should pay for the deployment of infrastructure as a private company? I guess there's probably also a business case, but what are your expectations there?
Generally, as I mentioned before, the building infrastructure, it is a big challenge, big investment challenge. And for sure, for this kind of company like PKN, we need to, let's say, show that this is real business case, even taking account that this is investment for the future. So I think that, and I agree with Charlotte, that there are now many programs appear connected with supporting building this infrastructure, like recovery plans, like CEF funding, this Connected Europe facility, or IPCEI, which I mentioned before. So this kind of support is needed from European, let's say, level, but also from national level. I think there is this kind of support will be needed just to prepare let's say, business case with covering this funding gap. But also, I think that it is worth to mention that we should look for full value chain. If, for example, we are talking about the hydrogen, we need to take into account, of course, cost of production of hydrogen, cost of logistics, cost of general investment. But also we should look for the consumers, for the market creation, yeah? Because if we do not start creation market, it will be difficult to achieve the main goal of reduction of CO2. So I give you the example of our approach regarding this first project connected with building hydrogen refueling station. We built, of course, public hydrogen refueling station, but mainly from parameters point of view, dedicated for local city buses, hydrogen city buses fleets. So we discuss with local governments, with fleets owners about their needs, about their plans regarding hydrogen buses implementation. And what is important, of course, two things for them are important. First, price of hydrogen. So if you would like to offer good price, let's say alternative for diesel, the similar price like diesel, we need to have support some incentives to building this infrastructure. But on the other hand, the second important for them, it is cost of hydrogen buses, yes, because this is also, they would like to calculate total cost of using these buses. So this is the second topic, and I think also this area needs support from some kind of national or European programs, just to allow at the very beginning at least achieving the economy on the level 0, just to start this building this infrastructure. Because in the future, I think that if we achieve the big scale of production of each equipment for building this infrastructure, then the cost of investment decrease, like we see the case of PV panels. So this approach, I think this is the best to develop. And also, if I can also add one remarks to Alexander, because he mentioned about synthetic fuels. Yes, also this direction is also interesting, and we analyzing it together with, let's say, hydrogen implementation, together with electricity charging infrastructure building, because this direction is also interesting from main goal point of view, CO2 reduction, yes, to achieve the carbon neutrality. Taking account situation of, let's say, Baltic Sea country, for example, we have big potential of production green energy from offshore wind farms. And in the future, this is really good idea to, let's say, produce big volume of hydrogen, which, of course, because of the storage of hydrogen is a big challenge. So good idea is to develop, and today is a good time for starting this kind of R&D projects to develop technology for production of synthetic fuels, maybe now even, I would say, synthetic hydrocarbons, which can be utilized in petrochemical sector, etc., just to utilize hydrogen plus CO2 and produce, let's say, synthetic hydrocarbons. So this is additional, let's say, point just to, let's say, give the answer. Also, Alexander mentioned that this is also interesting. So I also think that.
Okay, let me turn now to Ralph van Nuffel about a comment on who should pay for the deployment of infrastructure in your view, the role between the public and private sector. Ralph van Nuffel, your views on that.
Yeah, as we see today already, it's a collaboration of private and public initiatives, and it will have to continue to be like that. So and hopefully supported with subsidies, because the speed that we need actually to have the infrastructure that we would require ideally, the speed will be huge compared to what we have seen over the past years. So today we have about 200,000 charging points in Europe. And by 2029, we would potentially need up to 3 million if we consider the CO2 target, which today we assume only 37.5% reduction by 2030. So we're not even considering the other scenario that can go even to 50% reduction or more. So even with this, let's say, conservative assumption, 3 million stations are required by 29, which means the speed of deployment needs to be multiplied by 15 more or less. So we cannot underestimate the effort of this work. So we need to have private and public initiatives working together. And yes, of course, there is not just the investment, there will be some return on investment. especially as more customers will replace ICE by EV. So this is also important to be considered in the whole business case. And then we also have to bear in mind today's infrastructure is really not very well balanced across Europe. Yeah, it's really concentrated in a few markets which have put decarbonization high on the agenda. So I'm thinking of Germany, France, Netherlands. They have put a lot of effort on incentives on the one hand to get the price to an acceptable point, but also on infrastructure. So 69% of the current charging points are in those 3 markets alone. So we also, or especially Europe, should also try to support to make sure we have a spread across Europe and not just in a few selected markets. Because we cannot rely on just the private sector to take to take the initiative, because in those markets with almost no infrastructure today, return on investment will be far away. Yeah, the risk of the investment is much higher than compared to German or French investments. So this is also important to be considered.
Okay, thanks for that. We have a question coming from the audience, and I guess we will then conclude on that because we're getting closer to 11. So if I could ask you to please answer briefly. So we talked about Europe, but obviously there's a global transition going on. And that's a question coming from the audience. So China sold nearly 11 million vehicles between January and May this year. EVs only made up 200,017 of these vehicles. So what incentives can we create for them to also switch to electric mobility? And maybe you can start, Ravan Nuffel.
Incentives for China, is that a question?
Well, how can we make this transition global? Because we're putting in place systems for Europe to have more electric vehicles, more hydrogen-powered vehicles, infrastructure to back this up. Is this evenly spread also on a global level? I guess the answer is probably no.
I think it's the same thing as what I just said in Europe. Also in China, electrification has gone quite quick, but in certain metropolitan areas only. As I just mentioned, Germany, France, Netherlands, in Europe, if we leave those out of the European picture, there's nothing left almost. And China is also very decentralized, let's say. So if you look at the global figures, then the electrification looks very marginal, but you have to look into detail. Where is the infrastructure, and where are and as a result, where are the EV customers? So it's exactly the same story. Yeah. Incentives as well as infrastructure will be key wherever in the world if you want to talk about decarbonization of the automotive sector.
Very quickly, Gregor Josiak, your views about the global dimension of this transition. Is this something that you believe is sufficiently taken into consideration?
Yeah, generally in ideal world, we should have the same goals, and we should, let's say, have one direction to achieve, let's say, carbon neutrality and the impact for the climate. But it is very difficult, and also here additional question about the competitiveness regarding the industry business. So this is also a big question, how to, let's say, save this competitiveness in European region if this kind of carbon neutrality direction will not be implemented in other regions like China, etc. So
yeah,
it's a difficult question.
Of course, but there are steps being taken, and you can see that change is happening also in countries like China. But obviously, they have a much bigger geography to take care of. Alexandra Vondra, maybe a few thoughts about the global dimension of the transition to zero emission vehicles.
Well, certainly, the part of the Fit for 55 would be this CBAM, so this carbon border adjustment facility, if agreed within the WTO, not to have the carbon leakage in that's appropriate, certainly. But to think about the incentives to China, I am a democratically elected politician in the Czech Republic, not in China. So, and the reality is that at the end, it will be paid by the customers. You mentioned the two examples, France and Germany, that they are very friendly in developing the various incentives, but you have to take into account two things. With Germany, in my country and in Germany, everything costs the same, from bread and butter to the housing in the big cities. Everything is the same price, with one exception, and that's the electricity, which costs twice as much in Germany because of their incentives into the renewables and other things. So it means that the Czechs, at the end of the day, would have to pay twice as much for electricity. And we have to explain this to them. And France, it's another example. They have a low price of electricity because of using nuclear energy. But we have the problem in the EU because on one hand we want to save the world, from the carbon, and on the other hand, 2/3 of the EU member states are, because of the ideological reasons, against the nuclear energy. And frankly, I think that we have to make a choice here. For example, in our country, without nuclear energy, substituting for the coal phase out, we cannot do it. We don't have any wind. We don't have any solar enough. We don't have the solution for massive storage of the energy in the batteries yet. So I think we need to go back to the nuclear and to label this as a green source of energy. Without that, I think we would have a huge problem.
That will be for another debate, I think, because it's a huge one indeed. Maybe just very quickly to conclude, then, Charlotte Mathiessen, your views about how the transition to green mobility, how much of that is being coordinated between the EU and other major powers, like there was a summit with the US last week, or we spoke about China a little bit. How much of that is actually coordinated globally?
I was gonna go for an easy reply saying that we should look at our own flowers before looking at other gardens, but I can also just quickly reply there. And I think that of course China is a particular case, but globally with other countries and nations, I think in every area, whether it's research or transport policy or maritime policy, there is ongoing work, both bilaterally and multilaterally. So with a bit of faith, maybe, and then especially by going forward first with what we're doing here in EU and show the example, I think we can move forward in multilateral forums as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Charlotte. We'll end it here. Many thanks to the New Direction think tank for organizing this event, as well as to Hyundai for supporting it. Many thanks as well to our speakers for joining us. We are aware that some people watching the event from home may have experienced some audio difficulties, but fear not, you will be soon able to watch a full, clean version of the event that will be uploaded later today. I think that will be on the New Direction website. So for more events, you can go there, newdirection.online. Until then, take care and see you next time.